If for some reason we don't make it all the way through, which is certainly possible, don't worry about it. We can continue it in the next session, and I kind of designed it that way. So just one more reminder, I am recording, so please mute your microphones. If you have your homework from last time, that's awesome. If you don't, that's okay too, since I'm not really giving grades or anything. This is where we're at right now. So we're at session 201. We're going to be talking about researching your audience and planning your calendar, and we're also going to talk about what I call the 9 rules, actually the 8 rules, but we'll go back to that in a minute, for good content on the web. If you look at kind of where we're at in the process, we're going to be looking at steps 1 through 3 and 6 and 7 in this session. 4 and 5 we're actually going to do in the next session, and it's because even though they're right in the middle, they are things that if you had to, you could skip them. So I think it's pretty important that we get through these other ones first. This is kind of where we're at in the entire cycle, in the entire kind of course. And of course, links will be up at this address. I know that content's going to be going up on your internal network if it hasn't already. So very quick refresher from last time. We talked about how important content is. It's a basic element. It really kind of drives all marketing. And if you don't have it, there's no marketing because you're just saying nothing. We talked about how the real funnel is kind of an end-to-end, 2 funnels placed top to top. And we talked about how most companies focus on these last 3 steps in the funnel. But we really need to also address these first 4, and the ones we can deal with best here is with content that focuses on discovery, on building awareness. And content's goal in this context is to provide a return on time invested, or ROTI. We very briefly talked about the 3 types of content. We will talk about that more today, the 70, 20, 10, where 70 is sort of the standard highly scalable, 20 is a little bit riskier, you're testing things, it's a little bit more difficult to create, and 10 is the really sophisticated stuff that you're going for, where you're going for what's called evergreen or super viral content. So again, this is what we're going to be talking about. Notice the times in the right-hand column. Those are the time I estimate to do each of these things. Combined with frequency, they should give you a pretty good picture of what it takes to set all this stuff up. And yeah, just a reminder again, please remember to mute your phones because this is being recorded. So step 1 here is to sketch the audience. And this is all about, figuring out who you're going to be writing for. And a lot of folks turn this into this protracted existential experience with focus groups and all this other stuff. I'm not a big fan of that because the more you dig into your audience, the harder it gets to get a truly accurate picture of who that audience is. And I'll show you what I do dig into. I dig deeper into the questions they're asking than I do into the characteristics of the audience itself. But you don't need to be a mind reader to do all this, and that's one of the reasons this doesn't have to be an existential experience with focus groups and everything else. It should take you about 5 hours to plan this out, and this can be done as a group, it can be done individually, whichever, and you should only have to do it once a quarter at most. And the way I look at it is, it depends on how often you revisit your marketing. If you revisit your marketing strategy and how well it's working once a year, then that's when you should do this. If you revisit it every quarter, that's when you should do this. If you do it more often than that, if you revisit it more often than that, you should only do this if something's not working. And again, we'll talk about that in the next session. So there's 2 kinds of audience information that we need. We need demographics, which are kind of quantifiable data describing the attributes of your audience. And then we need psychographics, the needs, the wants, and the questions that people are asking. The former is really there to help you get the latter. So demographics are important, but psychographics are what really make or break a good campaign. So I'll just very quickly go over basic demographics. There's some great tools out there to help you find demographic data. And again, it doesn't have to be super hard. You can go into something like Google AdWords, for example, and use the display advertising planner and just type in a keyword like data backup and recovery, and then it immediately gives you feedback, and it tells you gender breakdown, it tells you age breakdown, it tells you device and things like that. And that really gives you some pretty fantastic information. It also, down at the bottom, you can see there, it gives you psychographic data, which we'll come back to in a minute. And then you can drill in even deeper. So Google Analytics has a built-in demographic analysis tool. Right now, it's not turned on for your site, and I'm betting it's not turned on because folks are concerned about sharing data with other companies. Just bear in mind, you get really good data back from this, and the data you're providing is dumped into this enormous pool. So they're not really going to get good intelligence about you from the data that you put out there. So just something to think about. You don't have to do it right now or anything, but this is just an example of what we get for portent.com. It's pretty specific. We can look at age groups and what's happening to traffic from age groups over time. We can look at geography, but you do have to enable it. So just think about that and what you can get out of that. And basically what Google's doing here is trying to expand the pool of companies and sites that are providing this data. So here we've got very rough demographics now. Ages 25 to 45, about 50-50 male-female. It's a little bit weighted more towards male. It's the nature of the industry, but given the margin of error and given the number of unknowns in there, it's about 50-50. There's no major ethnic trend. Most of your attention is coming from the U.S. and from India second. Michael, I'm not sure of your question about age groups, so if you can explain that a little, I can come back to it. And that's really all you need. Again, you don't have to get super specific. It would be great to narrow the age groups even more, but in this context, the questions are going to be more important than the age groups, because anyone in that age range is potentially someone who can help you by becoming aware and amplifying content. So now we get to psychographics. This is the really interesting part. And psychographics is all about understanding likes and dislikes, interests, affinities, which are other things that your audience may like that have nothing to do with this topic. I call them random affinities. And then most important, the questions they're asking. What can you answer in your content that will help you with this? So again, you can go to the Google Display Planner. You don't have to if you don't have access to it. Don't worry about it. I'm going to show you a lot of other ways to get at this data. But here, if you use the Display Planner, you can get this kind of nice list of interests, of topics. The only problem with the Display Planner for psychographics is it tends to skew heavily towards consumer, B2C products. For demographics, it's not quite as important because you can look at it with that in mind and just kind of tweak what you're seeing. But when it comes to actual interests and affinities, you have to be very, very careful. On the other hand, the affinity categories for your website are really useful. And again, this is from that demographic data where you have to enable it. But in Google Analytics, you can get a pretty good look at who's coming to your site and why. For example, for Portent, a lot of technophiles, a lot of movie lovers, which caused us to start doing more content that compares what we do to different movies. A lot of photographers, so these are all things that we can kind of pay attention to. And again, these are random affinities. It doesn't mean that someone who's a movie lover is going to hire Portent. It means that people we may want to market to also like movies, if that makes sense. So there's no relationship between what we do and the fact that they love movies. We just know that we can potentially access that audience by finding folks who love movies. If you don't want to get that fancy, or even if you do get that fancy, you can use this thing called Google Suggest. So if you go on Google and you start to type in a search, of course you get this list of potential searches. So for example here, I typed in disaster recovery and started typing data. I added data because general disaster recovery obviously covers a lot more stuff. And as you can see here, I get a whole bunch of potential topics. So these are things that people are searching for. Google is taking other query data as well as my history and saying, okay, given all of this, what should folks, what might you want to see? Now you can also start up your browser in private mode. So if you have Safari, you can start a new private browsing session. If you have Google Chrome, you can start an incognito browsing session and do this, and then it will ignore your browser history, and it will only use your query history. It will only use query data from around the web. So if you want to be really thorough, you can type in disaster recovery A, disaster recovery B, disaster recovery C. You probably don't need to do that here. I think that this gives you a pretty good picture of some of the things people are looking for. Best practices, geographic distance. Those are the kinds of things that you could probably write about, right? You could do a whole series of posts on best practices. You can also use a tool called ubersuggest.org. And what you do there is you type in your query, and then it goes to Google and does the A, B, C, D, E, F search. So if you look here, it has disaster recovery, then it has disaster recovery plus, meaning the phrase disaster recovery with another word after it. And then it does disaster recovery plus A, plus B, plus C, and you can scroll down the page and get all of this. It is a fantastic tool because it gives you all of that suggest data all in one place. You can also go into LinkedIn and say you're going to create an ad. You don't have to create it. You just go in and say you're going to create it. And you can start to type in a particular topic, or you can pick out a particular category. And then it will actually start to give you the size of the audience within that category. So if you want to test, let's say you found a query for data disaster recovery best practices. And so you want to go here and you figure that's information technology people. So you go in under job title and you look for information technology, and then you type in, you select the level of person you want, and you find out how big that audience is. This is a good relative comparison tool. All right. Plus, if you're going to promote content to a particular audience, this is a good place to go to do that, and I'll talk about that in the next session. One of my favorite tools for psychographic research is Quora.com. It is an enormous website where people just go to ask questions. That's it. It's a massive site where lots of questions get asked. So you can start typing in a phrase like disaster recovery and do a search, and you'll get lists of questions that people are asking. And here, why is disaster recovery important? That's very, very general. Might be a good post depending on who you're focusing on. If you're focusing on C-level executives, managers, business owners of medium about to become large businesses, things like that, that could be very useful. So you go and take a look at that question, and you may not be sure yet whether that question is worth answering. And I don't mean answering it on Quora, I mean answering it on your own website. So you take a look at the stats for the question. So when you click on the question, you'll see on the right-hand side, there's this little stats window. And you can take a look at, first of all, the number of people following the topic, which is disaster recovery. And you see there's 24,000 people. So that's a pretty good topic. There's some interest there. And of course, you can do this for every type of product you sell and every type of service you offer. So you can figure out which ones have the most interest. And then you can look at the question itself. How many people have looked at this specific question? All right, you've got 790 people. On Quora, that's a pretty good number. And as you explore, you'll learn more and more what good relative numbers are for your industry. You've got 11 people following the question right now. This suggests two strategies potentially. One is go on your own site and write a really good post about the pros and cons of cloud disaster recovery. And you might want to go on to Quora and write an answer there. You can't just link back to your own blog. That's considered bad etiquette. But you can write an answer there and then in your profile have a link back to your site. Because remember, content isn't just about what you write on your site. But the primary thing here is this is probably a good blog topic. Right? It's very specific. You just know right away, okay, I can write about the pros and cons of disaster recovery, and that's probably going to put me in very good shape. And I just, for fun, you don't have to do this, but I went back to Display Planner and tested that specific phrase, disaster recovery cloud. And again, just looked at the demographics, and they actually match up pretty well with the demographics that we found before of the general audience, which is a good sign, right? Because it means we're not looking at a complete skew where folks who like disaster recovery and Google Display like something completely different when they're talking about cloud disaster recovery. So this is just a good gut check for me to make sure I'm not going completely off into some random space. Another good tool to use is any collaborative filtering tools out there. So for example, on Amazon.com, you can search for a book. So I searched for disaster recovery, and then I looked under customers who bought this item also bought, and I can just scroll across and look and see what other stuff shows up. And if I see anything interesting in those books, I can start exploring that topic as well. In this case, not that crucial. I'm not getting any real revelations. It is interesting that there's more general business continuity discussions here. Again, if you're aiming for that broader audience, maybe that's something you want to look at. Now I'll go back to Google Suggest, right? Because I found out in Quora that cloud disaster recovery is definitely something people are looking at. So I type in disaster recovery cloud. And remember, even if you don't sell cloud disaster recovery solutions, this still might be something you want to talk about because there are pros and cons, right? So you can write an article that provides a very good, effective comparison of cloud to non-cloud disaster recovery solutions and have an invaluable piece of content. And for folks who are already thinking about buying cloud solutions, they're already thinking about it. You're not going to win them over anyway, but this way you've done something of great value to them, and maybe they'll come back when they want to talk to you about security or something else. For folks who are on the fence, of course, this is a chance to win them over. And for folks who have already decided to not go with a cloud solution, they can take a look at this and say, oh, okay, you know what? This is the best information I've seen. Why don't, I'm going to go ahead and use this. Then you want to do the same thing on Bing. So notice here, I got information on Google, I got information showing me that people are looking for specific kinds of reports as well, right? A PDF, a PowerPoint, which kind of gives me an idea of what I might want to produce. On Bing, I'm seeing pros and cons. So if you cross them over, you start thinking, all right, maybe I should do a slide share that I post to my blog that talks about the pros and cons of cloud versus traditional disaster recovery. And in all of this, don't forget your sales team. Your sales team is a great resource for information about what they're hearing and the questions they're getting. And you can layer that over all of this and just really build out your information. Kent, just so you know, Bing versus Google, the main difference is that Bing is a far smaller sampling, right? Bing only has, realistically, Bing has about 6 to 10% of the search world. The stats out there are a little bit skewed. So you're getting a narrower search volume. What we are finding, though, is that in large enterprises where Internet Explorer is still the default, it's installed in all the machines and people use it, Bing actually provides better business data in some cases because their audience is narrower and it tends to skew towards large enterprises where standard images are being rolled out to computers. But at a minimum, it's a good second look. It's a good place to kind of get second ideas because Bing's algorithm is a little bit different and their suggestion algorithm is a little bit different. One thing is if Bing and Google are ever in total, utter disagreement, like if you type in cloud disaster recovery on Bing and it's all about pictures of tornadoes, obviously, use common sense, stick with Google, but I've never seen a result that strange. I'm not going to talk about Facebook, and the reason I'm not going to is really, of course your audience goes there, but they don't go there for work. And it could get you some very strange artificial results. Plus, you're going to have enough to do. So I'm going to steer clear of Facebook for now. If folks decide it's a real priority, let me know, and I can add it into the next session. So what's our psychographic profile? Well, we've got a general interest around disaster recovery, which is good, right? Because we got those 24,000 people following that topic on Quora. We got people who are looking for the pros and cons. They're trying to decide on this versus other solutions. We know that from our Suggest data, from Quora, from all sorts of different places. And we know that they're looking for specific formats, potentially. And the only reason I say it is because if those specific queries are showing up in Google Suggest, that means there's a lot of people looking for that information, a lot of them. So you really want to pay attention to that. Sorry, just doing a quick adjustment in my screen here. So, I'll create very simple 2-sentence personas. Again, you can create incredibly elaborate personas. The more you can do, the better. But this may be all I need for the purposes of my my content calendar. All I need to know is that there's maybe 3, 4, or 2 basic kinds of people I'm writing to for this topic. I've got, Raymond Recovery, who's looking for very generic information. What are best practices? I've got Carrie, who's looking for information about cloud versus other solutions. And then I've got Perry, who's actually, and I named him after a cartoon that my kids really like, Phineas and Ferb. But anyway, Perry needs to present solutions to his boss, and because of that, needs some kind of material that he can hopefully use to create that presentation. And all of these people will appreciate getting any information they can, even if they don't end up picking up a NetIQ solution. This makes them into people who may forward your content to other people, which obviously builds awareness. They may simply like you for providing it and come to you for other solutions, which also builds awareness. Or they may decide that cloud is not for them because of your content and come back to you to purchase. By the way, I'm making the gross assumption that you don't have a cloud solution, but I actually think you do from looking on your site. Some of that stuff's a little bit above my pay grade, sorry. So then I'm going to double check where people come from. We can't evaluate individual topics and keywords anymore. That's because Google is hiding most of that keyword data. And there's a whole long story behind that I won't go into now. But since our focus is on the earlier part of the funnel, we don't have to look at individual keywords. We can just look and say, okay, where are people coming from? And here we know there's good quality traffic coming from organic search. So if we do awareness-based content, and we know that awareness-based content is generally people are gonna find it through social media, through organic search. They may find it through forms of paid promotion that are not targeted, but really the only way they'll find it consistently from paid promotion is highly targeted. And I'll talk about that kind of targeting next time. But here we know, okay, so creating content that caters to these psychographic profiles is probably worth it, because we know if we can get people coming to our site from these typical content-driven channels, we're going to get reasonably good visitors to our site. So how long should this part take? Well, you've already done demographics. The psychographic portion should take about 3 to 4 hours. Generally, I like to repeat it until I've got 5 to 10 fairly specific topics. Now, sometimes you get 3 or 4 topics in your first sweep, which is what we kind of did here, because we found, the presenters, the general best practices learners, and the folks who are looking for very specific information comparing cloud to non-cloud. Again, you could take days for this, but it's probably unnecessary. All right, you're trying to come up with niche content for your products, for your site. You don't have to go all over the place. So we've talked about sketching the customers. Now it's time to talk about mapping the journey. And I don't know how many folks had time to do this, but I'm going to show you how to apply it. And if we have time at the end, I'd love to hear some of them. The main thing is, though, you need that sketch, that information. So if you don't have one done yet, you're going to want to have one. And before the next session, if you want to send me a few of them, I can send back comments. I can let you know what I think they indicate, and we can work on them from there. So again, mapping that journey is also not an existential experience. We kind of figured out already the very generic path that people take for you. We figured out, generically the steps that are going to go on, and then we did that kind of journey mapping ourselves. Does anyone have one that they want to share? Uh-huh. Well, luckily I'm not calling on anyone. So we'll just move along here. So the journey doesn't take nearly as long to put together. Okay, it's a much more basic thing. You're taking those questions that you've mapped out, and you're just saying, okay, given these questions, where might people run into this content? And here you can see that I went for cloud versus non-cloud, people looking for general explainers, and PowerPoint and PDF. That's all going to happen in awareness, and then slowly slide over to consideration. So some of this, like the cloud versus not, that's great transitional content. So that's number 2. Now we're going to move on to mind the gaps. And this is pretty important, and it's very simple. So all you want to do is, first of all, you don't have to do a formal content inventory. David's working on that now, so don't worry about that. What you do want to do is just see whether you've already addressed these questions on your site, in non-branded content on your site. So here, I'm going to go in on your site. I'm going to use advanced search within your site. I'm going to search for disaster recovery, but I'm going to exclude any product names. And when I do that, I find nothing. Given that, it's pretty likely that I can beef up the non-branded content on the site. These are very, very good potential topics. And we found a gap, right? Now that you can write about disaster recovery. You can certainly create those PDFs and PowerPoints that can be linked directly in blog posts. You can create, kind of presenter guides. You can create blog posts that compare cloud to other solutions. And if you did this, if you did that Google Suggest work and that Bing Suggest work 3 or 4 times, you can fill this gap really, really effectively. And you've probably got 5, 10 or more blog posts that you can now write, drilling down to very specific stuff. Finding the gaps usually takes about 15 minutes, right? Because you just go to your site, you do a search, and you're done. You can use Google to do the same thing by searching for your brand name and then the topic, or doing a site:"netiq.com" and then putting your query, so it'll only search your own site. But you have a pretty effective search engine on your site, so you don't necessarily need to do that. And just repeat this until you've got 5 to 10 topic areas. You're going to use those to fill your calendar. And just so you know, I know that there's a broad content calendar already. What you'll want to do is create your own specific blogging content calendar. So next session, we'll talk about how you value these topics and the content you create through micro-conversions and behaviors. For now, though, we're going to jump to creating and revising the calendar. And creating the planner and the calendar, again, the calendar should be a guide. It should be a reference. It should not be the roadblock where you say, you know what, I didn't put this into my original calendar, so I'm not going to write it. If you come up with something great because of current events or something else and you want to add something new, just do it and move everything else around as necessary. So you look back at steps 1 through 3. What are the specific topics you came up with? And then each topic should generate 5 or more content ideas. So here, we talked about comparing cloud to non-cloud solutions. We talked about coming up with kind of materials people can use to present. The things that I think of right away are a general post comparing cloud to non-cloud, then one that specifically talks about security, one that specifically talks about redundancy, and so on. So you can really kind of drill down. You can have that first post for the presenter types, the higher level types, and then you can add more information post by post, and of course link them together. So you end up with this great resource. You've got 5 posts to write, or 4, whatever, and this becomes something that folks can really come and find and read and really work with. Within all of this, there are 3 kinds of content that you can create for your blog. Most of the time, it's going to be 70% content. And for 70% content, it's generally going to be a 1-person team, 2 hours, probably no more, It's stuff that's useful once. People will come and read it, and that's probably all they need. It's generally going to be a blog post or a single, very simple image of something, showing which button to click or showing a graph that's very important or something like that. 20% content requires at least 2 people, because generally there's going to be a writer and a creative, or a writer and a data person, or 2 writers, something like that. It's generally going to take about 4 hours total. It can take up to 8, but usually 4. It's going to be useful. It's going to be something people come back to periodically, and it's going to have potential to go viral, which is a term I hate, but it's just this idea that it would be passed around among your readers. Those could be blog posts. They could be non-traditional blog content, like a screencast. You're clicking around and showing stuff. It could be a slide deck, usually an existing one, but it could be new stuff. Downloadable PDFs, things like that. 10% content is the most experimental. It's generally going to require the most effort, at least 3 people. It's going to take more than 4 hours to create. It's going to be what I call evergreen, and what a lot of people call evergreen content, meaning it's going to be content that a year from now, 2 years from now, people will still come and look at. It can be heavily data-driven, so it can be things like infographics, again, a phrase I hate, but it describes it pretty well. It could be full video audio. It could be interactive, something where you click around to see information, or it could just be long-form content. I've written 5,000 to 10,000 word blog posts that are still getting lots of traffic today. That's a good example of 10% content. And by the way, the risky part is not that you're going to do something that might offend your audience. It's that you're trying to talk about a topic that maybe doesn't show up perfectly when you do when you do your psychographic analysis. Maybe it's content that does show up really well, but you're just not sure if the audience is really going to be interested. Whatever, it's something that there's more risk involved, either because of the resources involved, because of the topic you're choosing, or because of both. So the first thing you do before you create your content calendar is you want to create a planner, just a general idea of how often you're going to write different kinds of content in different time periods. So for example here, for July of 2014, I'm saying 2 pieces of 70% content per week, maybe 1 piece of 20% content every 2 weeks, and no 10% content in July because everybody's kind of staring out the window at the nice weather. By the way, this is just an example. This is not your content planner. And you can see kind of how I've set this up. It's just something, again, it's a general guide. It helps me think about resources I'm going to need ahead of time. So maybe I can go in and say, okay, you know what, in September, and in August and October, I'm going to need to line up more creative resources because I'm going to need help preparing that 10% content. Now you create your calendar. So you're going to cycle through your topics, narrowing them down to create more topics, broadening them as necessary, and you're going to try to push out your list 1 to 2 months. So for example, and these are just examples, I know that some of these are not things that you provide at all, but I'm going to put in my target audience, so the people I'm writing this for, the date that I want to have it go live, the title. If I'm assigning this to other writers, I'll put that in. And then I'll also assign a reviewer. I'll put in the type of content, the status, which means someone's writing it, it's been published, it's in production, it's being researched, whatever else. And then notes is just, whatever. It could be describing the type of content I expect to make. It could be, a question mark about something we need to find. And the way you maintain it is, I'll revisit it every 2 to 3 weeks. I don't want to run to the end of my calendar and then have to fill it in again. I want to keep expanding. I also want to look at how people respond to my content. If one piece of content gets tons of shares in social media, that's where you want to start. And then I will want to build on it using new suggest and Quora searches, as I said before. And then if 1 and 2 are just giving you nothing, if there's nothing else to write about, that's when you go back and you redo steps 1 through 3. Any questions so far? Okay, so the next step is the obvious one, which is creating the content. just so you know, I'm going to use a lot of examples from your site. I'm not picking on anybody, just so you know. The writing on your site's really good. It's impossible to edit bad writing. When you look at bad writing, you look at it and say, I have no idea. We need to rewrite this, otherwise I can't do anything. Good writing makes it much easier for me to use examples. What I couldn't do was get a whole lot of stuff from your competitors, if that makes you happy, because the writing was not so good. So the 8 rules, and I know I said the 9 rules at the beginning. I don't know why. I guess I'm a writer before a math person. But the most important rule is that no one cares. Okay? People are thinking of themselves. We are inherently egocentric creatures. You need to sell the page to me. When I see the title of your article, when I see the content, I need to know right away this is worth it to me. So, for example, there's an SAML message claims article on your site. Instead of just saying, working with SAML message claims or analyzing, say, save time, troubleshooting, right? Because, okay, save time, that's interesting to me. Learn to troubleshoot, okay. Maybe I'm trying to learn to troubleshoot these message claims. Those are titles that are going to help me. Then, I usually like to provide a preview. So in the first paragraph or 2 of the article, I'm going to provide a very brief list of what I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to say something like, when you're going to troubleshoot SAML message claims, you're going to want to go through these 3 steps. And then you list them and you say, here's the details. You go from there. That way people, again, have had that preview. Then, if you have a series of content, show the whole series. Right? So show the different articles that you've got in the series, and you do that very, very well. That increases implied value, right? Because if I read this one thing, I can then drill deeper. If I have questions, chances are I can get them answered with other stuff without having to go ask any questions, without having to take any additional steps as far as leaving this site or doing more searches. So as an example, here's this article about trending. And it's really, really useful because it's got a lot of good info about trends around the topic. It's someone at NetIQ, which is obviously great. What I might want to do is put the video, because there is a video further down the page. I might want to put that at the top or just below the first few lines. I might want to put an executive summary at the top of 2 or 3 sentences and then the video. Whatever, I'd like to see the video above the fold because people coming here, since it says My Security TV interview, they're going to expect to see a video when they get here. And this may cause people to take off. So another example here is just making, again, the topics immediately visible to the reader. There's a piece on the site that says, in this webcast, I'll describe how you can use, et cetera, et cetera. And then it goes straight into the webcast. But in that case, it's more of an informational webcast. So there, I'd like to know a little bit more about exactly what you're going to talk about, because in a webcast, I may have to sit there for 45 minutes watching the video. Before I take that time, I want to know. So again, selling the page, selling the content. And on this page, what I would do also is I would scoot that, in this webcast up the page. The first 3 paragraphs are helpful. But really they're general information. They're not necessarily about the topic itself. So it'd be great to have that kind of, again, the selling of the page first. And then either have the webcast or have this, or have the webcast and then this, or confine this to the webcast. So these 3 paragraphs could be actually the first things you say in the webcast itself. The next one is the blank sheet of paper test. If you walk away from all of this with no other rule stuck in your head, this is the one to remember. And it's the idea that any piece of content that you write, any discrete piece of content, if you write it on a blank sheet of paper, should make sense to a knowledgeable stranger. What that means is for things like titles, headings and subheadings, captions of images, summaries, whatever you're using to sell the page, that summary of content at the top, any other labeling or organizational information, that should all be something that if you write it individually on a piece of paper and show it to someone who knows your business, they know exactly what they're going to see when they get there. Why is that? Well, in print content, right, nothing was ever out of context. It was always title and then other stuff around it. But online, stuff gets taken out of context all the time. For example, this is just a nonsense site we use for testing. If someone's using a feed reader to monitor your website, they're going to see the title without anything else. If you write a blog post and someone does a search, they're going to see the title of the page and then maybe a brief summary, and that's it. And that's all they're going to see before they decide whether they're going to move on or not. So as an example, here's a title of one of your articles. This is a great one. All right, it gives a quantity. It says, using IT audits to maximize security. It tells me exactly what I'm going to get. And if you write that on a blank sheet of paper and show it to someone, they know what they're going to see. Same thing here. Cloud security training, big gaps, big opportunities. It's telling me about cloud security training. It's telling me about things that I can improve or room for improvement in the industry. That should say refined. That's really embarrassing. Not refence. Security 2010, when resolutions fail, that could probably be clearer. I don't know exactly what, does that mean at the end of 2010, at the beginning of 2010? And what exactly, is there a kind of resolution that's failing? Don't know. Another one we can refence. That's really embarrassing. Anyway, you could go to data security or IT security just to give an idea of exactly what kind of security this is, so you could at least narrow that down a little bit, just as an example. Here's a really good example, real world IT, disaster recovery that works for healthcare. All right, that tells me plenty. I might refine that to say, data center or something disaster recovery, but since you say real world IT, it's probably okay here. Again, passes the blank sheet of paper test. Yay, I spelled refine right. Reducing the cost of disasters in France. Well, that could be any kind of disaster, right? Data driven, it could be the cost of, restoring a town after it, fixing roads. It could be something like reducing the data cost of disasters in France, or reducing the cost of disasters for data in France, just something that explains it a little bit better. So why? Well, the other reason is for subheadings and captions, people tend to scan the page, as I'll talk about in a minute. If the subheadings and captions and such all stand on their own, if they all pass the blank sheet of paper test, it'll make it easier to scan. So that whatever part of the page their eye goes to first, they get an immediate idea of what they're going to see, and they can decide whether it will be useful or not. Some really painful examples of historic and tragic failures where people did not take care of passing that test. This is a baseball thing, but obviously just sounds completely gross. I went to law school, and this one was really painful. I'm a very open-minded guy, but I don't think that's exactly what they meant. So, again, please, blank sheet of paper test, very important. I don't expect anything like this would ever happen, but it does help you make sure content is clear. Next rule is just say it. So avoid the things that can make content much longer. We all do this. I do it too. I created a huge list of plague words and phrases, which will be up on your content site and is also in the link bundle. These are just some examples. Majority of can be must. A number of is many. GIF format is just GIF. In order to is just to. In spite of the fact that is although. All sorts of things like this. Also, talk to me. Okay, when you're just saying it, talk to me. You, I, and we. Not something like one or some or many, because you are talking to me. A blog is a less formal place. You don't need to take that kind of white paper academic tone of voice. Use active voice. So, an example is once the server is rebooted, instead say once you reboot the server. Again, you can see how this talks to me, and it just comes out and says it. Here's another example. So indeed, and this is a sentence straight off your site, indeed there's a high risk that because of poor server security, data backups may be compromised by viruses, DDoS attacks, or hacking. Well, first thing is I can get rid of indeed, because it's a given, right? Indeed means obviously or clearly, but you're writing it so it's obvious or clear. You can get rid of more of it and just say poor server security increases risk. right? Instead of starting there is a high risk that, because yeah, it's increasing risk. We get that. And then I can just reorganize things a little bit and say poor server security increases risk to data backups from viruses, DDoS attacks, or hacking. Another example here. So, and in results that should, I can just say readers of previous blog entries won't be surprised to find, once again, stark confidence level differences. I'm just getting rid of some stuff that doesn't need to be put in there and that you can shorten a little. And you can even make it shorter. At some point, obviously, you're taking out essential information, and you all have to decide that. But another example here, still have to be available up and running, in many cases pretty much 24/7. Corporate services, servers, and resources must be up and running close to 24/7. It's really all you have to say. In many cases, pretty much is a little bit wishy-washy, and people won't necessarily get it as an assertion, but those in this context, there wasn't a counterpoint before it, so you didn't need to use but. Still have to be available. Well, they must be up and running, so they are available. And in many cases, it's pretty much always in this context. Know the no's. What are the reasons people might not bother to read this? This really comes back to return on time invested. So, it'll be a waste of my time is the most important one. This will be too hard to read. I won't understand it. I've read this everywhere else. It's just a sales pitch. This all goes back to selling the page, right? And the blank sheet of paper test. And having really good subheads. And making sure you're writing directly to the reader. Those are all things that are really, really important here. Number 5, search engines do not buy your product or service. Okay, which means forget the keywords. Okay, write great stuff first. Link like with like. Pass the blank sheet of paper test. The reason for that is, yes, you use Google and Bing to do your research, but you use it to do those psychographics, to get those questions. If you did that, then you now know what the right phrases are because you've got those questions. If you then do all the things like passing the blank sheet of paper test and everything else, you're going to hit the search engines exactly the way you need to. So you don't need to sit there and think, I need to put this keyword into this many more times. Just don't ever think of that because it completely trashes the writing. Plus, Google actually is very sophisticated now about this. And if you intentionally start stuffing things with keywords, you may overdo it, and Google can actually end up dinging your site for it. I don't want to alarm people too much with that. Just kind of keep it in mind. Number 6, put on the brakes. And yes, that's an intentional spelling of brakes. When you write online, and indeed these things go all the way back to direct marketing by mail, you want no more than 13 to 16 words per line. You want your paragraphs to be no more than 6 to 8 lines. I actually prefer to see 4 to 5 lines. And then you want to see 3 or 4 paragraphs per chunk. And what I mean there by a chunk is you break it up. You break up series of paragraphs using subheadings or images or block and pull quotes, things like that. And then for listed content, use lists. Don't use commas in a paragraph or anything like that. What does this do? Well, it creates this highly scannable content. So if you look at this, if people just zip down the page skimming really quickly, there's obvious places they can kind of grab onto. And if they're reading, they can read portions and stop and come back. They can just read and take a breath now and then, whatever. There's a clear transition from one topic to the next. So this is a really interesting article, right? It talks about loss of services being one of the top threats. It's a little hard to get through this article. When I first look at it, it's very intimidating. This is a ton of stuff. If I just break it up a little bit with some subheadings, you can see it's a little less intimidating. Plus, it might be easier for me to figure out what's going to be going on in here. The image is excellent. I just want to create a little bit more room for the reader when they're going down the page. This is zooming in on the bottom of that same article. So here's those 3 big paragraphs. If I break them up a little bit smaller and add some subheadings, you can see that this just kind of makes it a little bit easier to get my head around. Use images wisely. If you're uploading images yourself, make sure you compress them. Okay, this image is 115 kilobytes. This one is 18. They really are. I really compress them. You can see there's no effective difference. It will load much faster, which means it's much more likely people will stay because this content provides a better promise of providing good return on time invested. Also, don't resize images in the software. So if you upload an image to WordPress and you don't convert it to a smaller size using an image editor, then you're going to end up converting it by just changing the height and width in HTML, and you'll get an image that loads very, very slowly because it'll be a huge image just smushed down into a small space. Tools you can use for compression, smush.it is a great one. WordPress obviously has built-in features. And then there are a couple of plugins. I know you all don't control the configuration of WordPress, but if you are looking for stuff that can help with this, Hammy and wpsmush.it are both very, very useful. If you want to test stuff and find images that are an issue, Google Page Speed Insights, again in the link bundle, which I'll give you the link to at the end, you can just go and type in an address, and here I picked on IBM. You can type that in and then it'll tell you whether there's images that need to be compressed. And it lists them and it gives you compressed versions. So that's kind of handy. There's a Chrome plugin that does the same thing and again gives me that list of images and then gives me the smaller images so I can actually just take them and use them. So here's an article where this image has been resized using HTML. So it just loads very, very slowly, and Google Page Speed found this for me. Rule 8 is to have a call to action, and this will become clearer when I talk about micro conversions, but you can already kind of think of what those would be. Share this, read more, follow us on Twitter. Those are micro conversions. They're things that once people do them, they're drawn in a little bit more, they appreciate your content, and they've helped you by spreading awareness. Those are things you really want folks to do. You can also obviously have them sign up for your newsletter or whatever else. So whatever you want to have folks do, just come out and say it. So this is great, right? So there was something here that specifically said, share with us. What other opportunities should cloud service providers take advantage of? The only thing I would have changed is I would have added post a comment below or contact us, right? So people then say, oh, okay, there's a form here. I'm going to post my idea here. So just a quick wrap up. Next time we're going to talk about microconversions and behaviors. It's going to go back through all this. I know I just went through a tremendous amount of material. The main thing to understand here is what's possible. Understand those top level steps of things that you need to kind of do to come up with your 70-20-10 content and your content calendar. The blank sheet of paper rule is really important. And then just the overall basic best practices. Your homework this time is to create a 2-week content calendar that's totally focused on the blog. Again, David's preparing the longer term general content calendar, but come up with that content calendar. Again, I'm not like grading people or something, but this is stuff you're going to need anyway, and this is a good opportunity to do it, and then shoot me an email or something if you have questions. And next time, we'll talk about metrics and measurement, and also we'll have an extended Q&A because we'll have a little bit more time. And this is where the link bundle is, portent.co/contentbest. And that's it. Any questions? Did I just blow everybody's minds with way too much information? Probably yes. Okay, well, thank you everybody very much. I will be converting this to video and sending it to David right after this, and I'll be well, the slides are already up and available. So I will talk to everybody next week. Thanks.